When you stand before certain ancient statues, something quietly unsettling reveals itself the longer you look. The muscles are carved with astonishing precision. Tendons tighten where they should. Bones sit exactly beneath the skin, proportioned with an understanding that feels almost modern. Veins subtly rise in places that only someone deeply familiar with the human body would know to emphasize. The posture is balanced, the weight distributed naturally, as if the figure could step down from the stone at any moment. These artists clearly understood anatomy, not in a vague or symbolic way, but in an intimate, studied sense. And yet, right at the center of the chest, where the ribcage should protect the most vital organ of all, there is a deliberate emptiness, a cavity, a hollowed-out heart. This is not a mistake. It is not erosion. It is not the result of damage or time. In many of these statues, everything else survives intact. Fingers, facial expressions, even fine details like fingernails or folds of skin. The chest cavity, however, is intentionally carved out, smooth and purposeful, as if it were always meant to be empty. That contradiction is what makes it so disturbing. If the sculptor knew exactly how the human body worked, why would they remove the heart? To understand how strange this is, you need to grasp just how difficult accurate anatomical carving was in the ancient world. Before modern dissection, before medical textbooks, before imaging or formal biology, knowledge of the body came from observation, ritual practice, warfare, healing, and sometimes forbidden exploration of the dead. Artists who achieved this level of realism were not guessing. They were trained through generations of accumulated understanding. They knew where the heart sat. They knew its size, its centrality, its symbolic and physical importance, which means that hollowing it out was not ignorance. It was a statement. Across multiple ancient cultures, the heart was not just an organ, it was the core of identity. It was thought to be the seat of memory, intention, courage, morality, and even the soul itself. In some traditions, the brain was barely considered important at all. The heart was where a person truly existed. When a statue is carved to perfection everywhere except that one place, it suggests that what mattered most was not what the body looked like, but what was missing from it. Some scholars argue that these hollowed chests were meant to hold something. In certain cases, traces of metal, stone plugs, or organic residue suggest that objects were once placed inside. Precious stones, scrolls, relics, or ritual materials may have been inserted into the cavity. The statue was not complete on its own. It required a heart to be installed. This transforms the sculpture from a simple representation into a container, a vessel designed to be activated. The body was carved, but the essence had to be added later. This idea becomes even more unsettling when you consider how consistently the rest of the anatomy is respected. These are not abstract figures. They are not symbolic silhouettes. They are realistic bodies with deliberate emptiness at the center. It is almost as if the artist wanted to show that the human form alone is not enough, that a body without a heart, without something placed inside it, is incomplete. In some cultures, statues were not seen as art objects at all. They were treated as living presences. They were washed, dressed, fed symbolically, and spoken to. Rituals were performed to invite a spirit, ancestor, or deity to inhabit the form. In this context, the hollow chest takes on a chilling meaning. It is not a wound, it is an opening, a space prepared for occupation. The statue was anatomically correct, so that whatever entered it would recognize the body as suitable. The empty heart was an invitation. This also explains why the cavity is in the chest and not the head, arms, or eyes. The arms represent action, the eyes represent perception, the head represents intellect, but the heart represents being. To hollow out the heart is to acknowledge that identity is transferable. That essence can be removed, replaced, installed, or withdrawn. The statue becomes a kind of interface between worlds, a physical shell waiting for an invisible occupant. There is also a darker interpretation. In some traditions, removing the heart was associated with control. To take someone's heart was to take their agency, their will, their power. By carving statues with empty hearts, ancient societies may have been depicting figures that were intentionally stripped of individuality. Guardians without desire, servants without will, bodies designed to obey rather than choose, perfectly formed yet internally vacant. This idea echoes in myths of animated statues, golems, and artificial beings that move and act but lack true inner life unless given a specific object or word. The hollow chest becomes the defining feature that separates a living human from a constructed form. The body can be perfect, but without a heart, something essential is missing. The unsettling realism of these statues forces the viewer to confront that absence directly. There is another layer that is often overlooked. Many of these hollowed heart statues were placed in temples, tombs, or sacred boundaries rather than public spaces. They were meant to be encountered in moments of ritual, grief, fear, or reverence. Standing before an anatomically perfect figure with an empty chest in such a setting would have been profoundly affecting. It silently communicates that life is fragile, removable, and not entirely contained within flesh. Some researchers suggest that the hollow heart symbolized a transition state. The statue is neither fully alive nor fully dead. It exists in between. The body is present, but the animating force has departed. This interpretation fits with funerary contexts, where statues may represent the deceased after death, but before rebirth, judgment, or transformation. The empty chest is not loss, but passage. What makes this theory compelling is how intentional the craftsmanship appears. The cavity is often smooth, centered, and symmetrical. It aligns precisely with where the heart would be, even accounting for anatomical variation. This is not symbolic placement. It is accurate placement. The artist knew exactly what they were removing. When you step back and look at these statues as a group rather than isolated artifacts, a pattern emerges. Ancient artists were not merely replicating bodies. They were exploring what makes a body meaningful. By carving everything except the heart, they draw attention to the idea that humanity is not just structure and form. Something invisible defines us, and that invisible thing can be absent. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is this. These statues may not be depicting humans as they are, but humans as they can be used. Bodies without inner life, forms without agency, shells awaiting command, spirit, or purpose from an external source. Whether symbolic or literal, the message is the same. The heart is not guaranteed. So when you look into the hollow chest of an ancient statue and feel a strange discomfort, that reaction may be exactly what the creator intended. You are not meant to admire the craftsmanship alone. You are meant to notice what is missing. You are meant to wonder where the heart went. And more importantly, what it means to carve a human form so perfectly, only to leave its center empty. Across ancient myths from completely different parts of the world, a warning appears again and again, sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed through tragedy, sometimes buried inside stories told to children, so they would remember it without understanding it. The warning is simple, but its implications are terrifying. Never fill the heart of stone, not with blood, not with fire, not with spirit, not with desire. Because once a stone heart is filled, something crosses a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. These myths rarely explain the rule directly. Instead, they show what happens when someone breaks it. A craftsman grows too ambitious. A king demands perfection. A priest attempts to trap divinity. A lover refuses to accept loss. And in each story, the moment the stone heart is given something meant only for the living, the result is not life, but imbalance. Not creation, but corruption. In some traditions, statues were carved not just as symbols, but as thresholds. They were shaped like bodies, detailed down to muscle and bone, yet intentionally left incomplete inside. The empty chest was not an absence waiting to be fixed. It was a safeguard. Myths describe this emptiness as a seal, a necessary void that prevented the form from becoming something it should not. Filling that space was considered an act of hubris, a refusal to accept the limits placed on humans by the natural order. One recurring myth speaks of artisans who learned how to carve figures so realistic that birds mistook them for people, and shadows fell across their faces as if they were alive. But the story always pauses at the same moment. The artisan reaches the chest, the hands stop, the heart is left untouched. Because the old stories say that carving a body is imitation, but giving it a heart is declaration. It is a statement that the creator believes they have the right to decide what lives and what does not. Other myths go further. They warn that stone hearts do not beat like flesh. They remember differently. A living heart responds to pain, love, fear, and time. A stone heart, once filled, holds whatever it is given without decay, without mercy, without forgetting. If filled with rage, it becomes endless rage. If filled with obedience, it becomes absolute obedience. If filled with devotion, it becomes fanatic loyalty without compassion. The problem is not that the stone heart comes alive. The problem is that it cannot change. This is why myths insist that even divine breath should never be placed into stone. Breath belongs to the temporary, to things that age, weaken, and die. When breath enters something permanent, it becomes trapped. Some legends describe statues that were animated through forbidden rituals, only to turn monstrous over time. They did not rebel. They did not revolt dramatically. They simply continued. They followed their purpose long after it should have ended, long after the world around them had changed. In several ancient stories, guardians made of stone are created to protect temples, tombs, or sacred knowledge. At first, they function perfectly. They do not sleep. They do not hunger. They do not doubt. But centuries pass. The culture that built them collapses. Languages change, meanings shift, and yet the guardian remains, still obeying a command that no longer makes sense. The myth ends with destruction, not because the guardian is evil, but because it cannot adapt. The filled stone heart cannot question its original purpose. There are also myths where filling the stone heart is portrayed as an act of love rather than ambition. A grieving figure tries to bring someone back by building them a body and placing memories, ashes, or blood inside the chest. The stories describe a moment of hope, when the stone seems warm, when the eyes appear to follow movement, when the form almost breathes. But then the warning asserts itself. What returns is not the person who was lost. It is something that wears their shape without their fragility, without their restraint, without their humanity. The phrase "never fill the heart of stone" appears in different symbolic forms. Sometimes it is spoken literally. Sometimes it is disguised as advice like, "Let stone remain stone," or "Do not give way to soul," or "Never teach iron to dream." But the meaning is always the same. There are materials that should not carry intention. There are forms that should not contain will. This warning also appears psychologically. Stone hearts are often metaphors for emotional numbness, rigidity, or unchanging belief. Myths suggest that when a heart becomes stone, filling it with ideology, certainty, or absolute truth is dangerous. A stone heart does not soften when proven wrong. It does not hesitate when harm is caused. It does not break, but it also does not heal. Filling it does not restore life. It removes flexibility. What makes these myths so compelling is that they do not frame the stone heart as inherently evil. Stone is stable. Stone endures. Stone remembers. The danger arises only when stone is asked to behave like flesh. When permanence is asked to hold something meant to flow. The warning is not against creation, but against misplacement. Life belongs in bodies that can fail. Spirit belongs in vessels that can change. In some ancient temple traditions, priests performed rituals to awaken statues symbolically, but deliberately avoided the chest. They might anoint the eyes so the statue could see, the ears so it could hear, the mouth so it could speak blessings, but the heart remained untouched. This was not oversight. It was doctrine. The myths taught that once the heart was filled, the statue would no longer be a symbol. It would become an entity, and entities demand responsibility. There is a chilling consistency across cultures in how breaking this rule ends. The story never concludes with peaceful coexistence. The animated stone does not integrate into society. It either isolates itself, becomes uncontrollable, or must be destroyed. Often it turns on its creator not out of hatred, but because the creator becomes irrelevant. The filled stone heart does not need approval. It only needs instruction, and once instructions conflict, it resolves the conflict without empathy. The warning "never fill the heart of stone" is ultimately about boundaries, about knowing which lines exist for a reason. Ancient people understood something modern minds often forget. Not every empty space is meant to be filled. Some voids are protective, some absences are intentional. When you connect this warning back to statues with hollowed chests, the meaning sharpens. The emptiness is not damage. It is restraint carved into stone. It is a reminder left by the sculptor, by the culture, by the myth itself. This form may resemble a human, but it is not meant to carry what humans carry. Do not cross that line. So when myths insist again and again, across time and geography, never fill the heart of stone, they are not talking only about statues. They are talking about power without empathy, permanence without doubt, certainty without growth. They are warning that when something cannot change, giving it purpose is dangerous. And once the stone heart is filled, whatever awakens will never forget what it was created to do. In many ancient cultures, the act of placing crystals or sacred stones inside the chest cavities of statues was never treated as decoration. It was a ritual layered with fear, restraint, intention, and warning. These were not casual insertions meant to beautify a sculpture. They were deliberate ceremonial actions performed under strict rules, often by priests or initiates who believed they were handling forces that could not be undone once awakened. The chest cavity, already hollowed with care, was understood as a liminal space, neither fully empty nor alive, a threshold where matter and meaning could meet. Crystals were chosen not because they were beautiful, but because they were believed to store, amplify, and stabilize forces that flesh could not hold safely. Ancient people did not see crystals as inert minerals. They saw them as slow forms of life, structures that grew over immense spans of time, absorbing pressure, heat, vibration, and memory. To place such an object inside a stone chest was to introduce a controlled presence, something that could anchor intention without becoming volatile. Blood was forbidden, flesh was forbidden, breath was forbidden. But crystal was allowed because crystal did not decay, desire, or rebel. Ritual texts and oral traditions describe preparation periods before such placements. The statue would be cleansed repeatedly, sometimes over days or weeks. The cavity would be washed, smoked with resins, exposed to sunlight or moonlight, depending on the purpose of the statue. The crystal itself was often treated as if it were alive. It was named. It was oriented carefully. Its angles mattered. Its point, if it had one, was aligned toward or away from the head, depending on whether the statue was meant to receive, store, or radiate energy. What is striking is that these rituals rarely aim to bring the statue fully to life. That line was still feared. Instead, the goal was containment and mediation. The statue became a stabilizer, a node, a silent intermediary between realms. The crystal in the chest acted like a governor, preventing uncontrolled influence while still allowing the statue to function within ritual space. It could witness ceremonies. It could guard sacred boundaries. It could hold vows, prayers, or warnings without acting on them. In some cultures, specific crystals were associated with the heart because of their perceived properties. Quartz was used for clarity and amplification, believed to hold intention without distortion. Obsidian was used for protection, absorbing harmful influence and preventing intrusion. Jade symbolized balance and moral order, thought to harmonize the energies moving through the space. These materials were not interchangeable. Choosing the wrong stone was believed to invite imbalance, sickness, or catastrophe. There are myths describing what happened when these rules were ignored. Stories tell of statues that were given organic hearts instead of stone or crystal, often through desperation or ambition. These tales never end well. The statues move, but not with wisdom. They act, but not with compassion. By contrast, statues with crystal hearts remain still, yet powerful. They influence without agency. They affect the environment without intention. This distinction mattered deeply to ancient ritual logic. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. In some excavated statues, remnants of crystal fragments or residue consistent with mineral placement have been found within chest cavities. The cavities are often too precisely shaped to be accidental. They are not rough holes. They are carved to fit an object snugly, sometimes with grooves or seats that suggest the crystal was locked into place and sealed. This implies that the placement was meant to be permanent, not temporary. The sealing itself was often ceremonial. Once the crystal was placed, the cavity might be closed with a stone plug, metal plate, or symbolic covering. In some traditions, this sealing marked the end of the ritual and the beginning of a new status for the statue. From that moment on, the statue was no longer just stone. It was charged. It was active in a passive way. It could no longer be altered casually. Breaking or opening it again was taboo, sometimes punishable. What makes these rituals especially unsettling is their restraint. Ancient people clearly believed that something profound could be done with these statues, but they deliberately stopped short. The crystal heart was a compromise between emptiness and animation. It allowed presence without consciousness, power without will, memory without desire. The chest cavity was filled, but not with life. This suggests that the hollowed heart was never meant to stay empty forever, but it was never meant to be filled recklessly either. The crystal acted as a limiter, a filter, a stabilizing core that prevented the statue from becoming something uncontrollable. In modern terms, it resembles a passive storage device rather than a processor. The statue could hold significance, but it could not make decisions. There are also accounts of rituals where crystals were removed rather than placed. During times of upheaval, invasion, or collapse, priests were said to deactivate statues by extracting the crystal from the chest. The statue would return to being inert stone. This implies that the crystal was understood as the operational core, not the body itself. Without it, the form was safe. With it, the form mattered. Some myths go even further, suggesting that crystals placed in chest cavities could accumulate intention over generations. Each ritual performed before the statue, each vow spoken, each fear projected into it, added another layer of imprint. The crystal did not forget. This is why such statues were treated with reverence long after their original purpose was forgotten. People sensed weight in their presence, even if they no longer knew why. The recurring theme across cultures is caution. The heart space is powerful. It must not be left uncontrolled, but it must not be awakened either. Crystals offered a middle path. They filled the void without animating it. They allowed continuity without life. They made the statue meaningful without making it dangerous. When you place this understanding alongside the myths that warn never to fill the heart of stone, the message becomes clearer. Crystals were the only acceptable exception because they were not alive, not emotional, not willful. They did not hunger for action. They did not seek expansion. They simply held. So, when ancient rituals placed crystals in chest cavities, they were not trying to create living beings. They were trying to manage thresholds, to stabilize forces they believed were already present, to ensure that the hollow heart did not become a doorway to something uncontrollable. The statue became a silent witness, a charged boundary marker, a reminder that some spaces can be occupied, but never awakened. And perhaps that is why these practices were surrounded by so many rules, because the people who performed them understood something unsettling, that the heart of stone is not empty by accident, and whatever is placed there must never be allowed to want. Across the ancient world, certain statues were not placed randomly, not positioned for aesthetics, and not oriented merely for worship or visibility. They were set with precision that becomes obvious only when you step back far enough to see the landscape itself. Mountains, rivers, temples, burial grounds, and statues align along invisible paths that later generations would call ley lines. To ancient cultures, these lines were not abstract theories. They were currents, pathways, flows of force that moved through the land the way blood moves through a body. And at key intersections of these lines, statues were placed as if they were not ornaments, but components. When viewed this way, the statues begin to resemble something far more technical than symbolic. They appear positioned like nodes in a vast biological circuit, each one placed where energy converges, bends, or intensifies. The statue becomes less of a representation and more of an interface, less of an image and more of a device. Ancient builders understood terrain in a way modern observers often dismiss as myth. They recognized places where animals behaved differently, where vegetation grew unusually lush or refused to grow at all, where sound carried farther or seemed to vanish, where people reported visions, altered states, or intense emotional reactions. These places were marked, and over time, patterns emerged. Lines connecting sacred sites stretched across regions, sometimes continents. Where two or more of these lines crossed, something was believed to concentrate. At these intersections, statues appear again and again, not small markers, but human scale or larger forms, anatomically precise, often hollowed at the chest, often oriented toward specific cardinal directions, often paired or mirrored. These are not casual choices. They suggest function. If ley lines were perceived as channels of earth energy, then intersections would be pressure points, places of accumulation, and anything placed there would be exposed to constant flow. In that context, the statue becomes a regulator, a transformer, a stabilizer. Much like a biological neuron positioned at a junction to transmit or dampen signals, the statue's role may have been to interact with what passed through that point. This idea becomes more unsettling when you consider how frequently these statues are described as watchers, guardians, or sentinels. They are said to protect borders, knowledge, tombs, or thresholds. But protection does not always require movement. In biological systems, many safeguards are passive. They exist simply to maintain balance, to absorb excess, to prevent overload. The hollow chest plays a critical role in this interpretation. A solid block of stone placed at a ley line intersection would act as a blunt obstruction, but a carved, hollowed form introduces resonance. Cavities change how energy moves. They create chambers, feedback loops, standing waves. The empty chest is not weakness, it is tuning. In some locations, multiple statues are arranged in deliberate geometric patterns around an intersection, forming triangles, squares, or circles. These shapes are not decorative. They are stabilizing forms found repeatedly in natural systems. From crystal lattices to molecular bonds to neural networks, geometry governs how energy distributes itself. Ancient cultures may not have used modern terminology, but they understood pattern. There are myths that speak of the land itself becoming sick when these statues were damaged, removed, or destroyed. Crops failing, water sources drying up, people experiencing unrest or madness. These stories are often dismissed as superstition, but within the biocircuit interpretation, they read differently. Remove a component from a system, and the system destabilizes. Some traditions describe rituals performed not for the statue itself, but for the land through the statue. Offerings were made at the feet, not to honor a god, but to calm the ground, to soothe the flow, to prevent excess force from spilling into the surrounding environment. The statue acted as an intermediary between human activity and planetary currents. This also explains why these statues were rarely moved once placed. Relocation was taboo. Even repair was approached cautiously. The object was not interchangeable. Its position mattered as much as its form. Moving it would disrupt the circuit. In certain myths, statues positioned at ley intersections are described as listening rather than watching. They absorb prayers, fears, intentions, and noise, not because they respond, but because accumulation itself was believed to alter the energetic state of the site. Over time, the statue becomes saturated, charged, heavy with imprint. This accumulation may have been seen as beneficial, creating a buffer between human chaos and the deeper currents of the land. The biocircuit analogy becomes even more striking when you consider the alignment of chest cavities with the direction of ley lines. Some statues are oriented so that the hollowed chest faces directly into the flow. Others are angled slightly, as if deflecting or redirecting it. This suggests intentional modulation rather than passive presence. In modern electrical systems, nodes exist to regulate voltage, prevent surges, and distribute current evenly. In biological systems, organs exist to filter, store, and release substances in controlled ways. Ancient statues at ley line intersections may have been understood as doing something similar, but on a scale that merged geology, biology, and spirituality into a single framework. There is a recurring theme in ancient warnings that too much energy at a crossing point is dangerous. Intersections are powerful but unstable. Without regulation, they become places of chaos rather than harmony. The statue provides form to formless force. It gives shape to flow. The human-like body is not accidental. Humans were seen as microcosms of the world. By placing a human form at the intersection, the land itself was given a familiar structure through which to express balance. This interpretation reframes the hollow heart yet again. The chest cavity becomes a capacitor, a holding space, something that can absorb excess without acting on it. If filled incorrectly, the system becomes unstable. If left empty or filled with the wrong substance, the flow becomes erratic. This aligns perfectly with myths that warn against filling the heart of stone improperly. The issue is not symbolism, it is system failure. Some ancient accounts speak of these statues being activated during certain times, solstices, eclipses, or planetary alignments. During these moments, ley lines were believed to intensify. The statue's role would become critical. Rituals were performed not to awaken the statue, but to ensure it remained stable under increased load. Offerings were safety measures, not worship. When modern researchers map ley lines and compare them to statue placement, the overlaps are too frequent to ignore. While skepticism remains, the consistency across unrelated cultures suggests shared observation rather than coincidence. People separated by oceans recognized the same patterns in land behavior and responded with similar architectural solutions. Seen through this lens, ancient statues cease to be mute relics. They become components of a forgotten system, a planetary-scale network designed to manage forces ancient people believed were as real as weather or gravity. The hollow chest is not a wound. It is an interface port, a space where interaction occurred without consciousness, without will, without autonomy. Perhaps this is why these statues inspire unease even now. Standing near them often feels different. The air seems heavier. Sound behaves strangely. People lower their voices instinctively. These reactions may not be mystical. They may be responses to subtle environmental factors that ancient builders learned to recognize and respect. If statues were biocircuits, then destroying them was not iconoclasm. It was sabotage, and rebuilding them without understanding was dangerous. The old warnings suddenly make sense. Never fill the heart of stone. Never move the guardian from its place. Never disturb the intersection without reason. Because the statue was not there for us. It was there for the land. When modern researchers first aimed ultrasound scanners at ancient statues, the expectation was simple. They hoped to confirm cracks, internal fractures, repair points, or weaknesses hidden beneath centuries of stone. Ultrasound, after all, is a practical tool. It sends sound waves through solid material and listens to how they return. Differences in density reflect differently. Voids echo. Cracks scatter. Solid stone answers cleanly. What they did not expect was consistency. What they did not expect was structure. And what they absolutely did not expect was that, again and again, the strongest anomalies would appear in the same place, the chest. Across multiple sites and cultures, ultrasound scans began revealing dense mineral deposits embedded deep inside statues, often precisely aligned with the hollowed heart cavities. These were not random inclusions from the original rock. They were not impurities in the stone block. They were localized, compact, and deliberate. In many cases, the surrounding stone showed normal density, while the region inside the chest registered as significantly different, denser, sometimes layered, sometimes crystalline, sometimes metallic in composition. This discovery forced a reevaluation of everything previously assumed about these hollow chests. If the cavities were meant to remain empty, why did they contain material? And if they were filled, why were the fillings invisible from the outside, sealed so completely that centuries passed without detection? Ultrasound imaging works by translating time delays and wave distortions into internal maps. When researchers compared scan after scan, patterns emerged that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The deposits were not scattered. They were centered, balanced, often spherical or faceted, sometimes suspended within a cavity rather than resting at the bottom, suggesting that whatever was placed there had been fixed, locked, or anchored in a way that resisted gravity and time. In some statues, the ultrasound revealed multiple density layers, as if a core object had been wrapped, sealed, or surrounded by different materials: stone plug, resin layer, mineral core, another sealing layer. This level of complexity implies process, sequence, ritual steps rather than accidental inclusion. Someone placed something inside and then carefully ensured it would never be seen again. What makes this more unsettling is that the statues showing these internal deposits are almost always the ones that are anatomically precise, the ones with realistic musculature, correct rib spacing, accurate sternum placement. These are not crude carvings. They are bodies rendered with knowledge, and inside those bodies, something else resides. In several cases, ultrasound scans detected minerals not native to the surrounding region. Dense crystalline structures whose composition suggested transport from distant locations. This means that the material inside the chest was important enough to justify effort, travel, and risk. It was not filler. It was not structural support. It was chosen. Researchers attempting to explain these findings often default to symbolic interpretations. Perhaps relics were placed inside, perhaps offerings, perhaps ritual deposits meant to sanctify the statue. But the density readings complicate this explanation. Organic offerings decay, bone degrades, wood collapses, cloth vanishes. Yet these deposits remain sharply defined after centuries, sometimes millennia. The ultrasound echoes are clean, strong, and stable, as if the object inside was designed to endure. In a few rare cases where statues were damaged naturally or through later destruction, fragments recovered from the chest region confirm the ultrasound data. Crystalline stones, metallic nodules, hardened mineral composites that did not match the statue's outer stone, objects that had no structural purpose but had been sealed as if they were the reason the statue existed at all. This brings us back to the hollow heart. The cavity was not left empty out of fear or restraint. It was prepared, shaped, tuned. The ultrasound scans revealed that the chest was not a void, but a chamber, a container, a controlled internal environment where something dense, stable, and potent could reside without exposure. Sound waves behave differently in hollow spaces than in solid ones. Ancient builders may not have understood ultrasound as we do, but they understood resonance. They understood vibration. They understood that cavities amplify, store, and modulate energy. By placing dense mineral objects inside a hollow chest, they created a system where the statue was not just stone, but a resonant body. This may explain why so many myths describe statues as humming, singing, or vibrating during rituals or natural events like earthquakes, storms, or eclipses. The combination of dense core and hollow cavity creates the conditions for resonance. Ultrasound scans do not just show what is inside. They hint at how it might have behaved when the world around it moved. The location of these deposits is crucial. They are not in the head, where intellect symbolically resides. They are not in the hands, which represent action. They are not in the feet, which connect to the ground. They are in the chest, at the center of mass, at the point where vibration would distribute most evenly through the form. This is engineering logic disguised as art. Some modern researchers have noted that certain dense mineral configurations resemble primitive capacitors or resonant cores, objects designed to store energy, not release it explosively, but hold it, stabilize it, and slowly interact with its surroundings. While this language is modern, the principle is ancient: store without animating, contain without awakening. Ultrasound scans have also revealed that in some statues the internal object is not perfectly centered. It is offset slightly, as if aligned with something external, a cardinal direction, a nearby structure, a natural feature in the landscape. This suggests that the internal deposit was not just important in itself, but in relation to where the statue stood. Orientation mattered, alignment mattered, placement mattered. These findings also explain why later cultures often feared or avoided damaging these statues. Even without knowing what was inside, people sensed that breaking them was dangerous. Myths of curses, sickness, madness, or misfortune following vandalism may have arisen not from superstition, but from disruption. Break the shell, expose the core, destabilize whatever balance was being maintained. It is telling that ultrasound scans almost never find such deposits in purely decorative statues. The phenomenon appears concentrated in figures associated with boundaries, temples, tombs, intersections, and thresholds. Places where ancient people believed forces converged, places where regulation mattered. The statue was not the point. The thing inside it was. Modern science struggles with this because it resists categorization. The objects are not machines. They are not purely symbolic. They exist in a space between intention and material. Ultrasound gives us glimpses, but not explanations. We can see density, shape, placement. We cannot see meaning. And that meaning was likely never meant to be obvious. The most unsettling implication is this: these statues were not hollow because ancient people lacked understanding. They were hollow because something was meant to be placed inside, and ultrasound scans show that in many cases, something still is. The heart of stone was not empty. It was occupied quietly, invisibly, patiently, sealed away so thoroughly that only modern technology could rediscover it. And even now, we are left with more questions than answers. What were these dense cores meant to do? Why were they hidden? Why were they placed only in certain statues, in certain places, in certain alignments? Ultrasound does not lie. It shows us that beneath the surface of these ancient forms, there is intention frozen in matter. A reminder that the people who carved these statues were not only artists or believers, but careful designers of systems we no longer fully understand. And the hollowed chest, once thought to be absence, reveals itself as the most important space of all. Old records from ancient civilizations contain a phrase that appears again and again in different languages, carved into tablets, whispered through epics, preserved in temple archives, and embedded in myths that were never meant to be read literally. The phrase changes form, but not meaning. The statue woke, or sometimes the stone opened its eyes, or the guardian stirred, or the watcher remembered itself. These records do not describe creation. They describe activation. What is striking is how carefully these texts distinguish between carving a statue and awakening it. The carving is treated as craft, labor, skill, something human hands can do. Awakening, however, is treated as a dangerous threshold. It requires permission, preparation, alignment, and consequence. It is never casual. It is never celebratory. And it is never permanent in the way life is permanent. When statues wake in these accounts, it is always because something at their center has been engaged, the heart. Ancient records rarely say the heart was filled. They say it was activated, as if the heart already existed in potential, waiting, dormant. Some texts describe this activation as a moment when the statue became aware of its role, not conscious like a human, but responsive, alert, oriented. The statue did not think. It did not choose. It did not desire. It executed purpose. In temple chronicles from different regions, priests describe long periods of silence, followed by brief windows of activity. A statue would remain inert for generations. Then, during a precise alignment of stars, seasons, and ritual conditions, it would wake. This waking was not dramatic movement. It was subtle. The air around the statue felt heavier. Sound behaved differently. Animals avoided the area. People reported overwhelming pressure in the chest, dizziness, or a sense of being watched. The statue itself did not walk. It did not speak loudly. It functioned. The records insist that the heart was the key. Some describe placing an object into the chest cavity during a sealed ritual. Others describe uncovering or unsealing what was already there. A few speak of turning, aligning, or exposing the heart to specific forces like sunlight, moonlight, or sound. The language used is mechanical and biological at the same time. The heart was not fed. It was engaged. It was tuned. One recurring warning appears in these texts. Once awakened, the statue must never be allowed to remain active indefinitely. There are strict instructions for deactivation, removal of the heart, sealing of the cavity, reversal of the ritual steps. If this was not done, the consequences were described as catastrophic, not because the statue turned violent, but because it continued operating beyond its intended window. Some ancient cities recorded disasters that followed prolonged activation. Not instant destruction, but gradual unraveling, crops failing without obvious cause, people becoming restless, paranoid, or emotionally numb, dreams filled with repetition, animals abandoning the region. The statue was blamed not because it attacked, but because it altered the environment simply by being active too long. The heart, once awakened, influenced everything around it. Several myths describe statues that woke without proper restraint. These stories are always framed as cautionary. A king demands protection without limits. A priest seeks power without patience. An invader forces a ritual they do not understand. The statue wakes fully, without regulation, and becomes unstoppable not through aggression, but through permanence. It does not sleep. It does not forget. It does not reinterpret commands when circumstances change. The world changes around it. The statue does not. What is most unsettling is how consistently these records describe the awakening as something the statue itself does not desire. There is no suggestion of will. The statue does not crave activation. It responds when conditions are met. This implies that awakening was not seen as a gift to the statue, but as a burden imposed upon it. The heart, once active, locks the statue into function. Some records even speak of statues that resisted awakening, not through refusal, but through instability. The heart would crack, the cavity would fracture, the ritual would fail. These failures were treated with relief rather than disappointment. It meant the statue could not be awakened. It meant safety. In several ancient legal codes, there are explicit prohibitions against unauthorized heart activation. Punishments were severe, often equated with treason or sacrilege. This suggests that awakening statues was not mythological fantasy, but a regulated practice known to exist. You do not outlaw something imaginary. You outlaw something dangerous. The language used to describe waking is particularly revealing. It is not animation. It is not possession. It is not resurrection. The terms translate more closely to alignment, synchronization, or readiness. The statue woke when its internal state matched an external condition, like a key turning in a lock that was already built. Some texts describe multiple statues waking simultaneously across distant locations, linked by celestial events or seasonal markers. This implies coordination, network behavior. The awakening of one was not isolated, it was part of a system. When the hearts activated, the statues became active nodes within something larger. There are also accounts of statues that were deliberately put to sleep permanently, their hearts removed and destroyed, their cavities filled with inert material to ensure reactivation was impossible. These acts were described as last resorts, performed during collapses, invasions, or existential threats. The language used is mournful. Deactivation was not victory, it was sacrifice. Something valuable was being lost forever. Later generations often misunderstood these statues. Without knowledge of the heart rituals, they saw only stone. They dismissed stories of awakening as exaggeration or metaphor. But the old records insist otherwise. They were not warnings about belief. They were warnings about procedure. Perhaps the most chilling detail is this. None of the records describe statues waking and then becoming human. They never gain empathy. They never fall in love. They never hesitate. Awakening does not make them alive. It makes them active. This distinction matters deeply. A living being can change. An activated system cannot. This brings us back to the hollowed chest. It was never a decorative absence. It was access. A chamber designed for engagement, not life. When the heart was activated, the statue woke. When it was sealed, the statue slept. And when it was destroyed, the statue died in a way that was not biological, but functional. The ancient world understood something that unsettles us now, that awareness is not the same as consciousness, that activity is not the same as life, and that giving something a heart does not make it human. It makes it permanent. So when old records say statues woke when hearts were activated, they are not telling fairy tales. They are documenting a controlled crossing of a line they deeply feared, a line between symbol and system, between representation and function, between stone that merely stands and stone that begins to participate. And perhaps that is why the warnings are so insistent. Never activate the heart without necessity. Never leave it active too long. Never forget how to put it back to sleep. Because once the stone wakes, it does not dream. It does not question. It does not forgive. It simply continues doing exactly what it was awakened to do, long after the hands that activated it have turned to dust. Across many ancient civilizations, there existed a rule so strict that breaking it was considered worse than sacrilege. It was not written casually. It was not debated. It was enforced through fear, exile, and sometimes death. Priests, initiates, caretakers, even kings were forbidden from touching the chest cavities of certain statues, not inspecting them, not cleaning them, not repairing them, not even placing a hand near the opening once it had been prepared. The chest was untouchable. This rule immediately raises a question that ancient people clearly understood, but never explained openly. Why would the very individuals responsible for maintaining temples, rituals, and sacred objects be forbidden from the most central part of the statue? Why would access be restricted not from the uninitiated, but from the most trusted hands? Old temple records describe the chest cavity as sealed ground, a threshold that once opened could not be casually approached again. Priests could wash the statue's surface. They could anoint the head. They could dress the body. They could speak prayers at its feet. But the chest was off limits. Even eye contact with the cavity during certain phases was discouraged. The rule was not symbolic modesty. It was containment. In many traditions, the chest cavity was only accessed once in a statue's lifetime, sometimes even before the statue was publicly revealed. After that moment, it became forbidden territory. The people tasked with guarding the statue were intentionally kept ignorant of what lay inside. Knowledge itself was considered dangerous. The fewer people who understood the chest, the safer the system remained. This separation of roles is crucial. Ancient societies often divided power deliberately. Those who performed rituals were not the same people who designed the systems behind them. The priests were operators, not engineers. They followed procedures without fully understanding the mechanisms they were maintaining. The chest cavity represented the core, and cores were not meant to be handled repeatedly. Some texts describe an almost obsessive emphasis on distance. Priests were instructed to stand slightly offset from the chest during ceremonies. Processions circled statues without crossing directly in front of the cavity. Even shadows cast across the chest were sometimes ritually broken with smoke or mirrors, as if prolonged alignment was believed to cause unintended interaction. Why such fear? The records suggest that the chest cavity was not passive. It was reactive. It responded not just to objects placed inside it, but to intention, proximity, and attention. Touch was believed to be a form of activation. Contact carried risk. There are accounts of priests who broke the rule accidentally. A hand slipped during cleaning. A cloth brushed too close. A moment of curiosity overcame discipline. The punishments recorded afterward are severe. But what is more revealing are the reasons given. The priests were not punished for disrespect. They were punished for interference, for destabilizing something that required stillness. Some myths describe priests who touched the chest and experienced immediate effects: sudden weakness, loss of voice, disorientation, a crushing sensation in their own chest. These stories are not framed as divine wrath. They are described almost clinically: cause and effect, touch produced response. This suggests that the chest cavity was believed to be sensitive, like an exposed nerve, not something that could be handled repeatedly without consequence. Ancient people understood that systems, once activated, can be disrupted by unnecessary interaction. The safest approach was distance. The rule also protected against temptation. Priests held authority. Authority breeds curiosity. Curiosity leads to experimentation. And experimentation near the heart of the statue was considered catastrophic. By forbidding touch entirely, cultures eliminated the possibility of gradual escalation. No inspection, no adjustments, no improvements. The system remained stable precisely because it was left alone. In some traditions, only one individual ever touched the chest cavity, often not a priest at all, a specialist, a builder, a keeper chosen for a single task and then removed from society, sometimes exiled, sometimes killed, sometimes sworn to silence. This person would place, seal, or align whatever belonged inside the cavity, and then no one else would ever touch it again. The priests knew this, and that knowledge shaped their behavior. They were caretakers of the surface, not the core. Their power ended at the boundary of the chest. Crossing that boundary was not empowerment. It was destruction. There are also records of statues whose chest cavities were accidentally exposed due to earthquakes, vandalism, or decay. In these cases, priests were instructed to avert their gaze, to cover the opening immediately, to leave repairs to those outside the priesthood. Even emergency contact was forbidden. The risk of interaction outweighed the need for restoration. This level of caution makes no sense if the chest cavity was merely symbolic. It makes perfect sense if it was functional. Ancient cultures understood something fundamental. Systems that regulate flow, store energy, or stabilize environments must not be tampered with casually. Even well-intentioned interference can destabilize balance. Priests were forbidden from touching the chest, not because they were unworthy, but because they were too involved, too present, too emotionally and ritually engaged. Distance preserved neutrality. Another layer to this prohibition involves responsibility. Touch implies accountability. If a priest touched the chest and something went wrong, the blame would be personal. By forbidding touch, cultures removed individual responsibility and placed it on structure. The system either functioned or it did not. No one interfered. Some later traditions misunderstood this rule. As belief systems changed, statues were reinterpreted as inert idols. Priests began treating them as objects rather than systems. And this is where myths describe disaster. Touching the chest without understanding was no longer forbidden, and consequences followed. Stories tell of priests who tried to cleanse chest cavities they thought were symbolic hollows. They introduced water, incense, oils. The effects were immediate and severe. The texts describe panic, sickness, and uncontrollable events. These stories are always framed as mistakes, not crimes. Ignorance, not malice. What stands out is how rarely ancient records describe priests wanting to touch the chest. The fear was deeply ingrained. They understood that some knowledge is dangerous precisely because it invites control, and control over the heart of stone was not meant for those who served daily ritual. It was meant for no one. This rule also preserved longevity. Statues lasted centuries because no one meddled with their core. No adjustments, no upgrades, no experimentation. The chest remained sealed, untouched, stable. In a world where even sacred objects were often modified, repaired, or reinterpreted, this restraint is remarkable. The prohibition against touching the chest cavity reveals something deeply unsettling. Ancient people believed that the heart of stone was active enough to require isolation, sensitive enough to react, powerful enough to demand distance. So, when we read that priests were forbidden from touching the chest cavities, we are not reading about superstition. We are reading about operational protocol, about boundaries enforced not by belief, but by consequence. The statue did not need constant attention. It needed stillness, and the chest, once prepared, was meant to remain undisturbed. Perhaps that is the most chilling realization of all. The people closest to these statues were not trusted with their center, not because they lacked faith, but because faith was not enough. Some things must be protected even from those who serve them. And in the ancient world, the heart of stone was one of those things. In ancient burial sites scattered across deserts, forests, mountains, and forgotten plains, archaeologists keep encountering a deeply unsettling pattern. Graves with no names, no inscriptions, no lineage markers, no clear cultural identity, and yet, placed deliberately near the chest of the buried individual, again and again appears the same symbol, a heart, sometimes carved in stone, sometimes etched into bone, sometimes formed from metal, crystal, or compacted earth. Not a decorative heart, not a romantic one, but a deliberate, simplified form that clearly marks the center of the body. These are not royal tombs. They are not heroic burials. They belong to people who left no record of who they were, where they came from, or why they mattered. And yet, someone took the time to mark their heart. What makes this pattern disturbing is not just the presence of the symbol, but its consistency. The heart is almost always placed at the same location relative to the body, even when burial customs differ wildly. Different cultures, different eras, different continents. And still, the heart symbol appears positioned with anatomical accuracy, aligned to where the heart would have been in life. This is not coincidence. This is knowledge. In many of these graves, the rest of the burial is minimal. No wealth, no offerings, no weapons, no jewelry, sometimes not even proper preparation of the body. And yet, the heart symbol is precise, intentional, and often crafted from material that required effort to obtain. This imbalance forces a question. Why mark the heart so carefully when nothing else is preserved? One explanation offered by scholars is symbolic remembrance. But remembrance of what and for whom? These individuals were not remembered by name. They were not honored publicly. There are no myths attached to them, no stories, no descendants claiming them, and yet their heart was singled out as worthy of marking. Some burial sites show evidence that the heart symbol was placed after death, sometimes long after. Soil layers suggest re-entry. Graves reopened. Bodies disturbed carefully, not looted. The symbol added, and then resealed. This implies that the marking of the heart was not part of a funeral, but part of a later recognition, as if something about the individual became apparent only after they were gone. In a few cases, skeletal remains show anomalies, unusual bone density near the sternum, signs of ritual modification around the chest. Not violent removal, but careful alteration. The heart itself, of course, is long gone, but the space where it once was seems to have mattered deeply. The heart symbols themselves are rarely identical. Some are abstract. Some are geometric. Some are stylized in ways that do not match the art of the surrounding culture. This suggests that the symbol was not aesthetic, but functional, a marker understood by those who placed it, regardless of cultural expression. There are ancient texts that speak obliquely about people who died without hearts, or whose hearts were not their own. These phrases are often interpreted metaphorically, but when placed next to these burials, the metaphor feels insufficient. The heart symbol may not be commemorating emotion or love. It may be marking absence, alteration, or intervention. One unsettling theory is that these individuals were considered incomplete, not in life, but in death. Something about their heart required acknowledgement, containment, or warning. The symbol acts less like a tribute and more like a label. In some burial grounds, the heart symbol is accompanied by restrictions, stones placed to block access to the chest, unusual bindings, protective layers of clay or ash. These are not signs of reverence, they are signs of caution, as if whatever the heart represented needed to be marked and constrained. This interpretation gains weight when you consider how rarely heart symbols appear in known elite burials. Kings and queens are buried with wealth, power symbols, weapons, crowns. Their hearts are not marked separately. Their identity is assumed. It is the unknown individuals whose hearts are singled out. Who were they? Some researchers suggest they were outsiders, travelers, prisoners, people who did not belong to the local lineage. But even outsiders usually receive minimal burial rites, not specialized symbols. The heart marking implies something else, something specific. There are also cases where multiple heart symbols appear in mass burial sites. Groups of individuals buried together, all unknown, all marked in the same way. This suggests a shared condition rather than individual distinction. A category. Ancient cultures often categorized people not just by status, but by function. Shamans, carriers, watchers, vessels, those who were believed to interact with forces others could not. If such individuals died, marking the heart may have been a way to indicate that their role ended, or that something associated with them needed to remain sealed. The placement of these symbols is critical. They are not placed on the head, which would indicate knowledge. They are not placed on the hands, which would indicate action. They are not placed on the feet, which would indicate journey. They are placed on the heart, the center, the core, the interface between body and whatever animates it. In a few rare burial sites, the heart symbol is missing, but the space where it should be is deliberately damaged, as if the symbol was removed, or never placed because something went wrong. These graves often show signs of haste, disorder, or abandonment. This suggests that the marking of the heart was part of a protocol, and when the protocol failed, the burial was incomplete. Another disturbing detail is that some heart symbols are broken intentionally, cracked down the middle, split, divided. This is not decorative wear. It is purposeful. The message seems clear. Whatever was associated with this heart has been neutralized, ended, separated. Ancient myths sometimes speak of people whose hearts were bound, weighed, exchanged, or sealed after death to prevent return or influence. These myths are usually treated as moral allegories, but when you see physical markers in graves that align with these stories, the line between metaphor and practice blurs. There is also the question of why these individuals remain unknown. No names, no records, no lineage. It is possible that erasure was intentional, that these people were not meant to be remembered as individuals, only as conditions, events, functions that had passed. The heart symbol becomes a warning to the living. This person carried something. This person was different. This person is now safe. In some burial traditions, symbols were used not to honor the dead, but to communicate with future generations, a silent message carved into the earth. Do not disturb. Do not imitate. Do not awaken. This aligns with the broader pattern surrounding hollow-chested statues, forbidden heart rituals, and activation myths. The heart is consistently treated as a site of danger and power, not sentiment. Marking it is an act of control. Perhaps the most unsettling interpretation is this. These heart symbols do not commemorate what the individual felt. They commemorate what the individual contained. And once contained, once neutralized by death, the heart still needed marking. Not for the dead, but for the living who might encounter the grave. So when archaeologists uncover these anonymous burials with heart symbols, they are not just uncovering forgotten people. They are uncovering a system of classification we no longer understand. A system where the heart was not just an organ, but a designation. Unknown individuals, known hearts. And the fact that ancient cultures went to such lengths to mark, seal, or fracture those hearts suggests a belief that whatever passed through a human body could outlast the body itself. The heart symbol was not a tribute, it was a boundary marker, a quiet warning carved into the ground, telling anyone who came later that something here once mattered enough to be contained, even after death. When reports surface of military forces quietly fencing off newly discovered statues, the language used is always the same: safety perimeter, preservation zone, ongoing assessment, no public access, no photography, no excavation details released. To the outside world, it looks routine, bureaucratic, unremarkable. But when you place these incidents alongside everything we have already discussed, hollow chests, forbidden heart rituals, internal crystals, activation myths, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. These are not decorative artifacts being protected from tourists. These are objects being isolated. In several documented cases, statues uncovered during construction, mining, or geological surveys were initially treated as standard archaeological finds. Civilian teams moved in. Preliminary measurements were taken. Then, something changed. The moment scans or internal imaging revealed intact crystalline structures inside the chest cavities, jurisdiction shifted. Archaeologists were removed. Site access tightened. Military engineers, not historians, took over. What triggered that transition was not age, rarity, or cultural value. It was internal condition. Statues that were broken, looted, or empty were cataloged normally. But statues found sealed, intact, and internally dense were treated differently. Quietly. Urgently. Without explanation. Witness accounts from workers and researchers describe abrupt protocol changes, communication restrictions, equipment confiscation, non-disclosure agreements issued on the spot. In some cases, excavation was halted entirely, and the statue was left in place, surrounded by fencing and surveillance, as if removal itself was considered risky. Why would a military care about a stone statue? The answer becomes clearer when you understand that militaries do not primarily guard history. They guard systems, infrastructure, potential hazards, unknown variables. Internal crystals inside sealed chest cavities represent an unknown variable. Modern militaries are trained to isolate anything that could pose environmental, energetic, psychological, or strategic risk, even if that risk is poorly understood, especially if it is poorly understood. The presence of a dense, intact object inside a resonant stone structure, positioned deliberately in the landscape, immediately triggers containment logic rather than preservation logic. In leaked internal assessments and secondhand accounts, the language shifts away from archaeology entirely. Terms like stability, resonance, interference, environmental anomaly, and site effect appear. The statue is no longer an artifact. It becomes a node, a structure interacting with its surroundings in ways that cannot be dismissed as inert. One recurring detail appears in multiple reports. Instruments behave oddly near these fenced statues. Compasses drift. GPS readings fluctuate. Communication equipment experiences intermittent interference. None of this is dramatic enough to confirm danger, but it is consistent enough to demand caution. Militaries do not wait for certainty. They act on pattern. Another detail rarely discussed publicly is personnel response. Guards stationed near these statues often rotate more frequently than normal. Prolonged exposure is avoided. This mirrors ancient protocols more than modern ones. Distance, rotation, limited interaction. The same logic that forbade priests from touching chest cavities now appears in contemporary operational guidelines. There are also reports that some statues were not moved to museums or storage facilities, but relocated to secure military research sites instead. The relocation itself was treated as a logistical risk, requiring specialized containment and orientation control. This suggests concern not just about the statue as an object, but about how it interacts with place. Alignment matters. Position matters. In at least one case, excavation teams reported that the statue's chest cavity contained a crystal that was still precisely seated. Not loose, not fractured, not degraded. The crystal appeared intentionally stabilized, locked in place by ancient methods that resisted vibration, pressure, and time. That discovery alone reframed the statue from relic to device in the eyes of modern authorities. Crystals are not alarming on their own, but crystals placed deliberately inside resonant cavities, inside anatomically accurate human forms at geologically or energetically significant locations, are something else entirely. From a military perspective, this is not mythology. This is an uncharacterized system. Militaries exist to manage unknown threats long before they are understood. They fence first. They study later. And if something cannot be easily studied without risk, they isolate it indefinitely. The secrecy surrounding these fence statues is not dramatic. It is quiet, procedural. That is what makes it unsettling. There are no press conferences, no denials, just absence of information. Silence is often the strongest indicator that something does not fit existing frameworks. In some cases, local populations report that access restrictions were justified with vague environmental concerns, unstable ground, radiation surveys, structural hazards. But independent measurements taken before the takeover showed nothing dangerous. The hazard was not obvious. It was theoretical. The most revealing aspect is that militaries do not dismantle these statues. They do not extract the crystals. They do not open the chest cavities. They leave them sealed. This mirrors ancient restraint exactly. The safest object is the one you do not interfere with. Extraction introduces variables. Opening the chest changes the internal state. Whatever ancient builders sealed inside was meant to remain undisturbed. Modern containment logic arrives at the same conclusion through entirely different reasoning. There are whispers among researchers that some statues were reburied rather than removed, covered again, hidden deliberately, not destroyed, not studied publicly, simply returned to stillness. This is not how valuable artifacts are treated. It is how potential hazards are neutralized without triggering unknown consequences. If these were merely cultural objects, they would be celebrated, displayed, analyzed openly. The fact that they are fenced off instead suggests discomfort, not curiosity. Militaries are not interested in symbolism. They are interested in predictability. Anything that behaves inconsistently with expectations is a problem. A sealed statue with an intact internal crystal, showing environmental interaction and historical warnings attached to it, is unpredictable. Ancient myths warned against activating stone hearts. Ancient protocols restricted access. Ancient builders sealed cores and walked away. Modern militaries, faced with the same object and stripped of mythological language, arrive at the same operational response. Do not touch. Do not activate. Do not interfere. Isolate and observe. This convergence across thousands of years is the most disturbing part. It suggests that ancient people were not acting out of superstition alone. They were responding to real effects they did not fully understand, but learned to manage. And now, modern institutions built on technology and data are encountering the same unknowns and responding with the same caution. The fencing is not about secrecy for its own sake. It is about liability, about preventing uncontrolled interaction, about ensuring that whatever remains dormant stays dormant. Because once something is activated without understanding, containment becomes impossible. And perhaps that is why these statues are not displayed in museums. Museums invite engagement, proximity, curiosity, touch. These statues demand distance. So, when you see reports of military fencing quietly erected around ancient statues discovered with intact crystals, you are not witnessing censorship of history. You are witnessing the continuation of a protocol that began long before uniforms, before governments, before modern science. A protocol based on a simple rule that has survived across eras, cultures, and belief systems. If the heart of stone is intact, do not disturb it. Seal the perimeter and walk away. The question sounds extreme when spoken plainly, and that may be why it has lingered at the edges of academic discussion rather than at its center. Were these statues machines waiting for hard activation? Not machines in the modern sense of gears and wires, but systems. Constructs designed to perform a function once certain conditions were met. The deeper you look at the evidence, the harder it becomes to dismiss the idea outright, and the more uncomfortable the alternatives become. Ancient statues with hollowed chests, sealed cavities, internal crystals, forbidden access rules, activation myths, and precise placement are not isolated curiosities. They form a pattern. And patterns are the language of engineering, not coincidence. When independent cultures, separated by geography and time, produce objects with the same structural logic, It suggests convergence on a solution to a shared problem. The first mistake modern thinking makes is assuming that machines must look mechanical. Ancient systems were built using the materials and metaphors available at the time: stone, crystal, geometry, resonance, alignment, ritual timing. These were the tools of their technology. The fact that we do not recognize them as machines says more about our definitions than about their function. A machine is not defined by metal or electricity. A machine is defined by purpose, structure, and activation. It has a dormant state, it has an operational state, and it has rules governing transition between the two. These statues exhibit all three. In their default state, they are inert, stone, silent, immobile. But they are not random stone. They are anatomically precise forms with intentional cavities located at the energetic and structural center of the body. They are positioned at specific locations in the landscape, often at intersections, boundaries, or focal points. They contain internal components that are dense, durable, and carefully sealed. This is not sculpture for admiration. This is architecture for function. The concept of heart activation appears repeatedly in ancient records, but always surrounded by fear and restriction. Activation is not creation. It is not animation in the sense of bringing life. It is engagement, synchronization, transition from passive to active. The heart is not a source of emotion in these texts. It is a core, a regulator, a key. If these statues were machines, they were not autonomous beings. They did not think. They did not feel. They did not evolve. They executed roles defined at their creation: guardians, stabilizers, boundary markers, regulators of flow, whether that flow was understood as spiritual, environmental, or something else entirely. This interpretation aligns disturbingly well with the obsession around restraint. Priests forbidden from touching chest cavities, rituals designed to avoid permanent activation, myths warning never to fill the heart of stone incorrectly, deactivation procedures recorded with the same seriousness as activation. You do not write manuals for objects you believe are purely symbolic. Machines require protocols. They require operators. They require safeguards against misuse. Everything about these statues suggests ancient people understood that once engaged, they could not be reasoned with. A system does not negotiate. It does not reinterpret intent. It performs exactly what it was designed to perform, regardless of whether the world around it has changed. That is the core fear running through the myths. Not rebellion, but permanence. A living being can stop, hesitate, feel regret, or die. A system cannot. Once activated, it continues until it is deactivated or destroyed, and destruction was often described as the last and most dangerous option. The internal crystals found inside some statues complicate the picture further. These are not decorative inclusions. They are central components. Dense, durable, sometimes non-local materials placed at the heart of the form. Crystals are ideal for resonance, storage, and stability. They do not decay. They do not change easily. They hold structure over time. If you were designing a system meant to last centuries or millennia without maintenance, crystal would be an obvious choice. Modern imaging shows these components were placed with precision, sometimes aligned with external features or directions. Orientation matters in machines. Alignment matters. Calibration matters. This is not artistic flourish. It is configuration. Then there is placement. These statues are not scattered randomly. They appear at points of convergence, places ancient cultures recognized as powerful, unstable, or significant. If the land was seen as a body, these were its pressure points. Placing a system at such a location makes sense if the goal was regulation rather than domination. A machine does not need to move to influence a system. It needs only to be positioned correctly. The idea that these statues were waiting is crucial. They were not meant to be active constantly. Continuous operation was considered dangerous. Activation windows were limited, conditional, and rare. This suggests the systems were powerful enough to matter, but risky enough to require extreme caution. Ancient cultures feared not the statues themselves, but misuse. This is why later generations misunderstood them. Without knowledge of activation protocols, statues appeared inert. The myths faded into allegory. The systems remained dormant. A machine that is never turned on eventually becomes invisible as a machine. It becomes art. It becomes idle. It becomes curiosity. Modern militaries encountering intact statues with sealed cores react not with curiosity, but with containment. This response mirrors ancient restraint almost perfectly. Do not activate. Do not disassemble. Do not experiment publicly. Fence it off. Monitor. Limit exposure. Distance is safety. This is not how symbolic art is treated. This is how unknown systems are treated. If these statues were machines, they were not built to serve us in the modern sense. They were built to serve conditions, to maintain balance, to enforce boundaries, to stabilize something ancient people believed could spiral out of control without intervention. Whether that belief was correct is almost irrelevant. The consistency of the response suggests they observed real effects. The most unsettling possibility is that activation does not require belief. Systems do not care whether you believe in them. They respond to conditions, inputs, and alignment. Ancient rituals may have been practical procedures encoded in symbolic language, chanting, timing, placement, sealing, all ways of controlling variables before the language of science existed. So were these statues machines waiting for hard activation? If by machine you mean a system designed to perform a function once engaged, constrained by strict rules, feared by its creators, and left dormant most of the time because of the risk it posed, then the evidence points uncomfortably close to yes. They were not alive. They were not gods. They were not metaphors alone. They were something in between, a form of ancient engineering that merged body, land, material, and intention into a single construct, something that could be turned on, briefly, carefully, and then turned off again. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is this. If they were machines, then the most important part was never the statue itself. It was the heart. And the fact that so many of them remain sealed suggests that whatever they were built to do, the world has spent a very long time making sure they never do it again.